August 16th, 1943, Port Moresby, New Guinea. Through the shimmering heat rising from the coral runway, Captain Max Weeks watched something that defied everything Imperial Japanese Army Air Force intelligence had told him about American fighters. A P-47C Thunderbolt was taxiing toward the flight line, its massive radial engine thundering even at idle. But it was the damage that made Weeks stop and stare. 27 bullet and cannon holes punctured the fuselage and wings. The right aileron hung partially shredded. Oil streaked across the cowling from a dozen small perforations. The pilot, a young lieutenant from the 348th Fighter Group, climbed out with a grin that suggested he'd just returned from a routine milk run rather than a dogfight with a dozen Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars over Leh. This was the Americans' first week of P-47 operations in the Southwest Pacific, and already Japanese pilots were discovering a disturbing truth. The ungainly American fighter that looked like a flying beer barrel didn't behave like other aircraft when hit. It didn't catch fire. It didn't explode. It didn't spiral out of control trailing smoke and flames. It absorbed punishment that would transform a lightweight Japanese fighter into falling debris. And then it brought its pilot home. 5,000 miles to the north, in a sparse briefing room at Wewak, Imperial Japanese Army Air Force intelligence officers were compiling reports that painted an increasingly troubling picture. The Americans had introduced a new fighter to the theater, one that contradicted everything Japanese tactical doctrine understood about aerial combat. It was heavy where Japanese fighters were light. It was armored where Japanese aircraft sacrificed protection for maneuverability. Most disturbingly, it survived battle damage that killed Japanese pilots. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived in the Pacific as an unwanted guest. Army Air Force commanders initially viewed the massive fighter with skepticism bordering on hostility. It weighed 7 tons fully loaded, nearly 3 times the weight of a Mitsubishi A6M0. Its fuel consumption was voracious. Its turning radius at low altitude made a freight train look nimble. Everything about the Thunderbolt violated the established wisdom of Pacific air combat, where success belonged to lightweight, maneuverable fighters that could outturn their opponents in close-quarters dogfights. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, accepted P-47s only because he couldn't get enough of the preferred P-38 Lightnings. The Lockheed twin-engine fighters were popular with pilots, effective in combat, and suitable for the vast distances of Pacific operations. But production couldn't keep pace with demand. That left the Thunderbolt, an aircraft designed for the high-altitude battles over Europe, to prove itself in a theater where most combat occurred below 15,000 feet. The first Thunderbolt unit to reach the Pacific was the 348th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Neil Kirby, a pre-war Army Air Corps pilot with an aggressive temperament and innovative tactical mind. Kirby studied the P-47's characteristics and developed a revolutionary approach to Pacific air combat. Instead of trying to dogfight Japanese fighters at their own game, he would exploit the Thunderbolt's unique advantages through boom and zoom tactics borrowed from Luftwaffe pilots over Britain. Kirby's P-47s would climb to 25,000 feet or higher before approaching Japanese airfields. At that altitude, where Japanese fighters gasped for air and struggled to maintain performance, the turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced full power. When enemy aircraft appeared below, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive, accelerating to speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. At those velocities, no Japanese fighter could evade. The Americans would make one devastating firing pass with their .850 caliber machine guns, then use their tremendous speed to zoom back to altitude before Japanese pilots could react. The tactics worked brilliantly during the 348th's first combat mission on August 16, 1943. Escorting transport aircraft to Marilinen, Kirby's pilots encountered approximately a dozen Ki-43 Oscars. The lightweight Japanese fighters were considered among the most maneuverable in the world, capable of outturning any Allied fighter in a low-speed dogfight. But maneuverability meant nothing when P-47s dove from above at 400 miles per hour. Captain Max Weeks engaged an Oscar in a head-on pass. The combined closing speed exceeded 700 miles per hour. Both pilots opened fire simultaneously. Weeks felt his Thunderbolt shudder as Japanese bullets struck home. but his .850 caliber machine guns poured 100 rounds per second into the fragile Oscar. The Japanese fighter disintegrated, literally coming apart in midair as the concentrated firepower severed structural members and ignited fuel tanks. Weeks pulled out of his dive and assessed the damage. Multiple hits had punctured his wings and fuselage. One round had struck the armored windscreen, leaving a spiderweb crack but failing to penetrate. Another had hit the massive radial engine, punching through a cylinder but failing to stop the power plant. The P-47 flew on, responsive and controllable, bringing Weeks home to Port Moresby. The 348th Fighter Group claimed 2 confirmed victories that day without losses. More significantly, every pilot returned, including those who had taken battle damage. Japanese intelligence officers, reviewing combat reports from surviving pilots, noted the troubling resilience of the new American fighters. Sergeant Takeo Yamamoto, a veteran pilot with the 248th Sentai, filed a report after the August 16th engagement that revealed Japanese confusion. The new American fighter is very large and appears clumsy. We attacked from advantageous positions and observed multiple hits. The enemy aircraft absorbed our fire, but did not fall. One fighter I engaged personally took at least 30 rounds from my twin 13mm machine guns. I observed strikes along the fuselage and wings. The American did not evade or return fire immediately, leading me to believe I had inflicted serious damage. Then the enemy dove away at tremendous speed. I attempted to follow, but could not match his velocity. Yamamoto's experience became increasingly common as P-47s flew more missions over New Guinea. Japanese pilots discovered that hitting the Thunderbolt was relatively easy given its size, but destroying it proved nearly impossible. The massive radial engine mounted in the nose created a wall of steel, aluminum, and high-octane fuel that absorbed incoming fire while protecting the pilot. Unlike inline liquid-cooled engines that could be disabled by a single lucky shot that ruptured cooling lines, the R-2800 continued running even with multiple cylinders destroyed. The engineering that made the P-47 nearly indestructible began with Alexander Kartvel's radical design philosophy. While other fighters minimized weight to maximize performance, Kartveli built strength into every component. The fuselage structure featured redundant longerons, meaning that even if Japanese gunfire severed one primary structural member, others carried the loads. Control cables were duplicated and routed separately, so battle damage to one system didn't leave pilots helpless. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plate 3/8 of an inch thick behind the seat, half-inch bulletproof glass forward, and armored deflection plates around the engine. Self-sealing fuel tanks represented another revolutionary safety feature that astonished Japanese pilots. American fuel tanks used inner liners made of rubber that automatically sealed around bullet holes, preventing fuel from streaming out and igniting. Japanese fighters lacked this technology. A single incendiary round into a Zero's fuel tank often meant immediate catastrophic fire. P-47 pilots routinely returned from missions with fuel tanks punctured by multiple rounds, the rubber liners having sealed around each hole. On October 11, 1943, Colonel Neil Kirby demonstrated the P-47's firepower and survivability in an engagement that would earn him the Medal of Honor. Leading 4 Thunderbolts on a sweep over Wewak, Kirby's formation encountered 40 Japanese aircraft, including bombers and fighters at various altitudes. Most American fighter pilots would have considered the odds suicidal. Kirby saw an opportunity. Diving from 25,000 feet, Kirby's P-47 accelerated past 400 miles per hour. He opened fire on a bomber formation, his convergent stream of .50 caliber fire disintegrating one aircraft, then immediately rolled into a climbing turn to engage fighters attempting to protect the bombers. Within minutes, Kirby had shot down 6 Japanese aircraft, a remarkable feat of marksmanship and aggressive tactics. Japanese return fire struck Kirby's Thunderbolt multiple times during the engagement. Cannon shells exploded against the fuselage, machine gun bullets stitched across the wings. One round penetrated the cockpit, missing Kirby by inches. Yet the P-47 continued fighting, its 8 guns speaking with devastating authority. When fuel ran low, Kirby dove away at over 500 miles per hour, leaving pursuing Japanese fighters far behind. Ground crews at Port Moresby counted 32 bullet and shell holes in Kirby's aircraft. None had struck critical systems. The massive engine had absorbed several hits without significant performance loss. The structural damage was superficial. Within 24 hours, the P-47 was repaired and returned to combat status. Japanese intelligence summaries from late 1943 reflected growing concern about the Thunderbolt's resilience. One report, recovered after the war from captured documents, stated, "The new American P-47 fighter demonstrates exceptional resistance to battle damage. Multiple verified instances exist of these aircraft sustaining damage sufficient to destroy Japanese fighters while continuing combat operations." Pilots report that concentrated fire from 13mm machine guns and 20mm cannon produces observable hits without corresponding aircraft losses. This resilience appears to derive from heavy structural design, redundant systems, and protective armor exceeding that of previous American types. The report recommended that Japanese pilots concentrate fire on the P-47's cockpit area, the only section not protected by the massive engine. However, achieving the precise marksmanship required to consistently hit such a small target proved nearly impossible during high-speed combat. Most encounters occurred at combined closure rates exceeding 600 miles per hour, giving pilots only seconds to aim and fire. The frustration Japanese pilots experienced manifested in increasingly desperate tactics. Some pilots attempted to ram P-47s after exhausting their ammunition, a tactic that occasionally worked against lighter American fighters but proved suicidal against the Thunderbolt's mass and structural strength. In at least 3 documented instances, Japanese fighters attempting ramming attacks simply bounced off P-47s, the collision destroying the attacker, while the American aircraft sustained repairable damage and returned to base. One such incident occurred in December 1943 over Arawe, New Britain. Second Lieutenant James Porter was leading a flight of 4 P-47s, providing cover for amphibious landings when his formation was bounced by 8 Ki-43 Oscars. During the ensuing dogfight, Porter's Thunderbolt was hit repeatedly by one particularly aggressive Japanese pilot who closed to point-blank range, continuing to fire even after his ammunition was exhausted. Porter later described the encounter in his combat report. "The Oscar stayed on my tail through 2 complete turns. I could see his guns flashing but couldn't shake him. Then he stopped firing but kept coming. I realized he was going to ram me. I pushed the nose down hard and felt a tremendous impact on the tail. The whole aircraft shuddered. When I checked my 6, the Oscar was spinning down in pieces. My P-47 was still flying, though the rudder felt mushy." Post-flight inspection revealed that the Japanese fighter had struck Porter's horizontal stabilizer with enough force to tear a 2-foot gash in the metal skin and bend several internal structural members. The Oscar had disintegrated on impact, killing its pilot instantly. Porter's Thunderbolt required 3 days of repairs but returned to combat operations. This incident, and others like it, reinforced Japanese pilots' growing sense that they were fighting an opponent they simply couldn't hurt with conventional tactics. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual combat encounters. Japanese ground personnel at airfields targeted by P-47 strafing attacks reported that the sound of approaching Thunderbolts created panic among troops. The distinctive deep roar of the R-2800 engine, different from the higher-pitched sound of Japanese radials or the whine of inline engines, became associated with impending destruction. Unlike other American fighters that might be driven off by concentrated anti-aircraft fire, P-47s routinely pressed attacks through flak that would discourage other aircraft. Ground crew accounts from Wewak Airfield described P-47 attacks in terms that emphasized the Thunderbolt's apparent invulnerability. One Japanese mechanic, Corporal Kenji Tanaka, survived multiple strafing attacks and kept a diary that was recovered after the war. "The American P-47 fighters attacked again today. Our anti-aircraft guns fired continuously. I saw tracers striking one American aircraft repeatedly. Pieces flew off the wings. Smoke came from the engine. I thought surely it would crash. Instead, it completed its strafing run, destroying 3 aircraft on our flight line, then climbed away to the east. How can we fight such machines? They do not die." The seeming invincibility of P-47s created a self-reinforcing cycle of demoralization among Japanese pilots. As experienced pilots were killed and replaced by inadequately trained recruits, the quality gap widened. Veteran pilots who understood the Thunderbolt's vulnerabilities and knew how to exploit them were systematically eliminated. Their replacements, fresh from abbreviated training programs that Japanese instructors joked lasted just long enough to learn how to take off, faced P-47s without the experience needed to survive. These rookie pilots often made fatal mistakes. They would attempt traditional dogfighting tactics that played to Japanese fighters' strengths, only to discover that P-47 pilots refused to dogfight. They would damage Thunderbolts and assume the enemy was finished, only to watch their target escape at speeds they couldn't match. They would expend their limited ammunition on P-47s that simply absorbed the hits and kept fighting. Each failed engagement taught lessons that many pilots didn't survive to apply. The mathematical realities of aerial gunnery favored the P-47. Japanese fighters typically mounted two 13mm machine guns with limited ammunition loads. A 2-second burst expended approximately 50 rounds total. The P-47 carried 8 50 caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds total, sustaining fire for over 30 seconds if needed. At typical engagement ranges of 300 to 400 yards, the Thunderbolt created a cone of destruction containing 100 projectiles per second. Anything caught in that stream faced instant obliteration. The weight and velocity of 50 caliber bullets provided another advantage. At 750 grains each, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, these projectiles carried tremendous kinetic energy. When armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck Japanese aircraft built from lightweight aluminum, with minimal protection, they punched through structures, ignited fuel, and destroyed control systems. The lightweight 13mm bullets fired by Japanese fighters carried less energy and frequently failed to penetrate the P-47's armor and heavy construction. By early 1944, Japanese pilots had developed a grudging respect, tinged with fear for the Thunderbolt. Captured diary entries and interrogation reports revealed the psychological impact of facing an opponent that refused to die. One pilot, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura of the 68th Sentai, wrote after an engagement over Wewak, "Today I fought the American P-47 fighters. I achieved multiple hits on one enemy aircraft during a diving attack. I observed my tracers striking the wings and fuselage. The American did not react as expected. He did not catch fire, did not lose control. Instead, he accelerated in his dive and escaped. This is very discouraging. We hit them, but cannot kill them." The discouragement Nakamura described became widespread among Japanese fighter units. Pilots who had confidently engaged American P-40s and Australian Spitfires found themselves facing opponents who absorbed damage that would have been fatal to other fighters. The psychological advantage shifted to the Americans. P-47 pilots knew their aircraft would protect them, allowing them to press attacks aggressively. Japanese pilots grew cautious, aware that even successful gunnery might not produce results. On March 5, 1944, Colonel Neil Kirby's luck finally ran out. Leading a fighter's sweep over Wewak, he dove to low altitude to confirm a probable kill. A Kai-43 Oscar caught him in a vulnerable position, and this time, the Japanese pilot's aim was perfect. Cannon shells struck Kirby's cockpit directly, killing him instantly. The P-47 crashed into the jungle below. Kirby's death illustrated that even the Thunderbolt had limits. The cockpit, despite armor protection, remained vulnerable to direct hits. But his loss was notable precisely because it was rare. The top 10 American P-47 aces in the Pacific all survived the war, except Kirby, a survival rate unmatched by pilots of any other fighter type. The introduction of the P-47N model in early 1945 brought the Thunderbolt's evolution to its ultimate form for Pacific operations. Republic aviation engineers had addressed the fighter's primary weakness, range. The P-47N featured redesigned wings with increased internal fuel capacity and provisions for larger external drop tanks. With full fuel loads, the N model could fly over 2,000 miles, making it capable of escorting B-29 superfortresses from Iwo Jima to targets across Japan. The 318th Fighter Group received the first P-47Ns in the Central Pacific in April 1945, operating from captured airfields on Saipan. Additional units, including the 413th, 414th, and 507th Fighter Groups, deployed to Iwo Jima and Ieshima, with P-47Ns as the war entered its final months. These aircraft flew very long-range missions to Japan itself, engaging Japanese fighters over their home islands while providing cover for B-29 raids. Japanese pilots facing P-47Ns discovered that the latest Thunderbolt variant had eliminated the type's few remaining weaknesses. The improved propeller and engine modifications gave the N-model climb performance matching Japanese fighters. The increased range meant Thunderbolts could pursue Japanese aircraft anywhere, eliminating the previous sanctuary of distance. Most importantly, the N model retained all the legendary toughness that had made earlier P-47s so difficult to destroy. First Lieutenant Urban Drew, flying a P-47N with the 413th Fighter Squadron from Iwo Jima, experienced the Thunderbolt's survivability firsthand on the war's final day of combat. On August 14, 1945, Drew's flight strafed Japanese airfields on Honshu. Ground fire struck his aircraft multiple times. Cannon shells exploded against the wings. Machine gun bullets punctured the fuselage. One round struck near the cockpit, showering Drew with metal fragments. Despite the damage, the P-47N continued flying. Drew completed his strafing pass, destroying several parked Japanese aircraft, then turned for the long flight back to Iwo Jima. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine ran roughly but maintained power. Control response was degraded but manageable. After 6 hours in the air, Drew landed safely at Iwo's central field. Ground crews counted 43 separate bullet and shell hits. The aircraft was repairable and would have been back in combat within days if Japan's surrender hadn't ended the war. The maintenance crews who kept P-47s flying developed their own appreciation for the aircraft's toughness. Technical Sergeant Michael Romano, a crew chief with the 348th Fighter Group, described the experience of repairing battle-damaged Thunderbolts. "We'd see these birds come back shot to hell, and we'd think there's no way that's flying again. Then we'd start assessing the damage and realize that nothing vital was hit. The engine might have holes in 3 cylinders, but the other 15 were fine. The wing might be torn up, but the main spar was intact. Control cables might be severed, but the backup cables still worked. It was like the damn thing was designed to be shot and keep flying." Romano recalled one particularly memorable incident involving a P-47D flown by Lieutenant Robert Chen in February 1944. Chen's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a low-level strafing attack on Hansa Bay. A 37mm shell exploded directly beneath the fuselage, sending shrapnel through the aircraft's belly. The blast severed hydraulic lines, destroyed the radio, punctured the oil cooler, and tore a hole in the fuselage large enough to fit a basketball through. Chen came back with oil streaming out, hydraulic fluid everywhere, and this huge hole you could see daylight through, Romano remembered. The whole bottom of the aircraft looked like Swiss cheese. Chen said he thought he was done for when the shell hit, but the engine kept running, the controls still worked, and he was able to nurse it home. "We patched that bird up in 4 days, and it was back in action. Any other fighter would have been scrapped." The resilience of individual aircraft created a culture of confidence among P-47 squadrons. Pilots gave their aircraft names and treated them as lucky charms. One P-47D named Lucky Lady completed over 100 missions, despite accumulating so much battle damage that maintenance crews eventually replaced nearly every panel on the aircraft. The structural core remained intact throughout, testament to the strength of Republic's design. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing captured American maintenance records were astonished by the repair rates. American units routinely returned aircraft to combat after sustaining damage that would have rendered Japanese fighters total losses. This repair capability reflected both the Thunderbolt's inherent toughness and the sophisticated American logistics network that kept spare parts flowing to forward airfields. Japanese units, by contrast, often had to cannibalize multiple damaged aircraft to keep a few flying, a process that steadily eroded their effective strength. The disparity in maintainability extended to normal operations as well. P-47s required less frequent maintenance than Japanese fighters and were easier to repair when problems arose. The R-2800 engine, while complex, was designed for field maintenance by relatively unskilled personnel. Cylinders could be replaced individually, components were standardized and interchangeable. Technical manuals provided clear, step-by-step instructions for common repairs. Japanese engines, particularly the temperamental Nakajima Sakai, that powered the Zero, required specialist knowledge to maintain properly. Replacement parts were often unavailable. Technical documentation was limited. As the war progressed and Japanese logistics deteriorated, aircraft sat grounded for lack of basic maintenance items, while American P-47s flew continuously supported by an unending stream of supplies. The final statistics of P-47 operations in the Pacific validated the aircraft's design philosophy. Thunderbolt units achieved a favorable kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, shooting down 697 enemy planes while losing significantly fewer of their own to aerial combat. More importantly, P-47's loss to enemy action represented only a small fraction of total losses, with the majority of casualties resulting from accidents, mechanical failures, and operational mishaps rather than Japanese fighters. The survival rate told an even more compelling story. Approximately 65% of P-47 pilots hit by enemy fire returned safely to base. This contrasted sharply with lighter American fighters like the P-38, where battle damage often proved catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's combination of armor, redundant systems, and rugged construction meant that pilots had excellent chances of surviving even severe combat damage. Japanese military analysts conducting post-war assessments acknowledged their fundamental misunderstanding of American design philosophy. One report from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force Technical Evaluation Center stated, "The American approach to fighter design prioritized pilot survival and mission completion over theoretical performance advantages. While our fighters achieved superior maneuverability and climb rate, these advantages proved largely irrelevant when American pilots could absorb damage that destroyed our aircraft and continue fighting." The P-47 Thunderbolt exemplified this philosophy. Though heavy and less agile than Japanese fighters, its durability, firepower, and protective features made it a more effective combat weapon under actual combat conditions. The report continued with an analysis that captured the core lesson. Superior technology and tactical doctrine cannot compensate for fundamental industrial capacity. The Americans produced over 15,000 P-47 fighters during the war, each built to standards that prioritize strength and reliability over weight savings. They could afford heavy construction because their industrial base supplied unlimited aluminum, steel, and manufacturing capacity. We lacked these resources and built fighters accordingly, sacrificing protection and durability to maximize performance from limited materials. This asymmetry doomed our pilots to fighting at a fundamental disadvantage. Perhaps the most telling evidence of the P-47's psychological impact came from captured Japanese pilots during interrogation sessions late in the war. When asked which American fighter they feared most, many Japanese pilots named the Thunderbolt, despite acknowledging that technically superior aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and F-4U Corsair were more dangerous in pure air-to-air combat. The reason was simple. Pilots could outfly a Mustang through superior tactics or luck, but no amount of skill could compensate for the fact that shooting down a P-47 required perfect marksmanship under impossible conditions. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most successful fighter aces with 64 victories, encountered P-47s late in the war and came away deeply impressed. Though Sakai's memoir primarily focused on his experiences against other American types, he noted in post-war interviews that the Thunderbolt represented everything Japanese fighter design was not. "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy lighter American fighters with a few hits, seemed to have no effect on the P-47. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart. The Americans understood something we did not. In modern warfare, the side that brings their pilots home wins." The evolution of American fighter tactics in the Pacific demonstrated how the P-47's unique characteristics influenced combat doctrine. Early in the war, American pilots had attempted to dogfight Japanese fighters using imported European tactics that emphasized maneuverability and sustained turning combat. These approaches proved disastrous against the nimble Zero and Oscar. The P-47 forced a rethinking of tactical fundamentals. Instead of trying to outturn Japanese fighters, American pilots learned to exploit speed, altitude, and firepower. The Thunderbolt excelled in all three categories. Boom and zoom attacks from altitude allowed P-47s to engage on favorable terms, using their superior diving speed to close rapidly, destroy targets with overwhelming firepower, then escape before Japanese pilots could respond. This approach minimized the importance of turning radius while maximizing the American advantages in engine power, structural strength, and armament. The psychological transformation this wrought among American pilots was profound. Early in the Pacific War, American fighter pilots had felt outclassed by Japanese opponents flying superior aircraft. The introduction of the P-47, particularly when flown according to proper tactics, reversed this dynamic. American pilots knew they flew aircraft that could absorb punishment and deliver devastating firepower. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics that kept Japanese pilots constantly defensive. Japanese fighter units, already suffering from declining pilot quality as veteran pilots were killed and replaced by inadequately trained recruits, found themselves facing not only material disadvantages, but psychological ones as well. Combat against P-47s became an exercise in frustration. Japanese pilots would achieve hits. See their tracers striking home, yet watch their targets continue fighting. The Americans, meanwhile, only needed brief firing opportunities to destroy fragile Japanese fighters with their overwhelming gun batteries. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the Pacific ultimately represents the triumph of industrial might and engineering pragmatism over lightweight elegance. Japanese designers had created beautiful fighters, aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was aerodynamically possible with minimal weight and power. But beauty and elegance proved irrelevant when facing opponents who survived being shot and responded with firepower that destroyed anything it touched. The Americans had built a flying tank, wrapping their pilots in armor and surrounding them with redundant systems, then giving them guns that could saw enemy fighters in half. It wasn't graceful or particularly sophisticated, but it was devastatingly effective, and more importantly, it brought American pilots home alive to fight again. As P-47s returned from missions riddled with bullet holes, leaking oil, flying on damaged wings and rough engines, Japanese pilots learned the hardest lesson of the Pacific War. American fighters weren't just machines. They were manifestations of industrial power so vast that the Americans could afford to build aircraft strong enough to absorb damage that would kill lighter opponents. Every P-47 that survived what should have been a fatal hit drove home the reality that Japan was fighting an enemy with resources so overwhelming that even hitting them wasn't enough. The Thunderbolt never became the most glamorous American fighter. That honor belonged to the sleek P-51 Mustang with its bubble canopy and sculptured lines. The P-47 remained the big, brutish workhorse the aircraft mechanics loved because it was nearly impossible to break, and pilots loved because it brought them home. But in the desperate skies over New Guinea, the Solomons, the Philippines, and eventually Japan itself, Japanese pilots who watched their bullets disappear into Thunderbolts without effect understood a fundamental truth. They were fighting aircraft they couldn't kill, flown by pilots who kept coming back, backed by a nation with resources beyond imagination. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt proved that sometimes, in warfare, the best defense is simply being too tough to kill. Japanese pilots never expected America's heaviest fighter to survive so much damage. By the time they learned otherwise, it was too late. The sky belonged to the Jug. If you enjoyed learning about this incredible aircraft and the men who flew it, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from aviation history. The courage of both American and Japanese pilots deserves to be remembered, along with the machines they flew into combat.